Eerie background music begins low and unsettling. Welcome back everyone to the channel. I appreciate you tuning in because tonight we're venturing into those corners of the world where the shadows cling a little tighter and the silence seems to hold its breath. We're about to explore 5 stories, each one more unsettling than the last, tales that whisper of encounters so chilling. They're said to be rooted in real terrifying events. These aren't your typical campfire tales. These are the experiences that burrow deep under your skin, the kind that make you question that flicker you just saw in the corner of your eye, or that faint sound you heard from the other room when you thought you were alone. Now, I always say, the like button, well, it's a fickle creature easily spooked. But if you're brave enough, and you appreciate these journeys into the strange, dark, and mysterious, consider giving it a gentle tap. It helps more than you know. Tonight, we're not just telling stories, we're peeling back the veneer of the ordinary to glimpse the unsettling realities that might be lurking just out of sight. These narratives are designed to linger, to make you pause before you turn off the hallway light, to perhaps make you double-check the locks on your doors and windows. The accounts you're about to hear come from people who claim these things genuinely happened to them, or to someone they knew. They are experiences that have left indelible marks, moments where the veil between our world and something else grew terrifyingly thin. We're talking about unexplained disappearances, unsettling apparitions, and encounters that defy logical explanation, leaving only a cold dread in their wake. So, find a comfortable spot, maybe grab a blanket, you might need it. And if you're watching this late at night, well, you've been warned. Prepare yourselves because these stories are crafted to do more than just entertain. They're intended to make you think, to make you wonder, and yes, quite possibly, to keep you up all night, listening to the creaks and groans of your own home with a newfound apprehension. The darkness holds many secrets, and tonight, we're going to uncover a few of them. Are you ready? Because our first descent into the unexplained is about to begin, let's not waste another moment. Imagine, if you will, a neighborhood so peaceful it could be on a postcard. Willow Creek was exactly that kind of place. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, the distant sound of children laughing in the afternoons. It was the sort of community where everyone knew each other, or at least offered a friendly wave. In one of these charming houses lived a family, our narrator's family, and for them, life in Willow Creek was predictable, comfortable, and safe. Or so they believed. Their home backed onto a small, picturesque pond, a place of tranquil beauty. Next to their property stood an abandoned house. This structure wasn't just empty, it felt derelict, exuding an aura of neglect and silent sorrow. Windows were boarded up, paint peeled from the siding, and the yard was a tangled mess of overgrown weeds and creeping vines. Local kids whispered stories about it, tales of strange lights and unsettling noises. But for the most part, it was just a gloomy, silent neighbor. The family kept a small flock of ducks in their backyard near the pond. These weren't just anonymous birds, they were pets, each with its own quirky personality. Every morning the grandmother would go out to feed them. The ducks would waddle around, swim in their little section of the pond. They were a constant, a small feathered part of the family's daily rhythm. Then one morning, the familiar quacking was absent. The grandmother went out to the pond as usual, but the ducks were gone. All of them. Vanished without a trace. There were no feathers scattered about, no signs of a struggle, no indication of a predator. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, spirited away in the dead of night. The family searched the yard, the surrounding bushes, even peered over the fence into the overgrown wilderness of the abandoned property next door. But there was nothing. Just an eerie silence where there used to be life, and a growing sense of unease that settled over the household like a cold fog. The grandmother in this story was a practical woman, not prone to flights of fancy or easily frightened. She had seen her share of life, raised a family, and possessed a sturdy, no-nonsense attitude. However, the disappearance of the ducks had unsettled her more than she let on. It wasn't just the loss of the birds, it was the utter lack of explanation. She started sleeping a little lighter, her ears attuned to the nighttime sounds of the house and the yard, a new vigilance taking root within her. She'd find herself looking out the window more often, a sense of watchfulness she couldn't quite shake. Several nights after the ducks vanished, sleep eluded her entirely. It was one of those oppressively still nights, the kind where every tiny sound seems amplified. The clock on her nightstand showed it was 3 a.m., an hour often associated with the strange and the unsettling, the so-called witching hour. Unable to rest, she felt an inexplicable urge to get up and look out her bedroom window, the one that faced the backyard, and beyond it, the looming silhouette of the abandoned house next door. Perhaps she hoped to see a fox, or some other mundane explanation for the missing ducks, something to put her mind at ease. As her eyes adjusted to the deep shadows of the pre-dawn darkness, she scanned the familiar landscape. The pond was a dark, glassy sheet, the trees were still, and then her gaze drifted upwards towards the roof of the abandoned house. And that's when she saw it. A figure, a small figure like that of a young girl, walking slowly, deliberately, along the peak of the dilapidated roof. The girl was wearing a dress, and even in the faint moonlight, the grandmother could make out its color, a stark, vivid red. It was a chilling, utterly bizarre sight, this childlike form treading so precariously in the dead of night. The grandmother blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, a figment of her tired mind. But when she looked again, the girl in the red dress was still there, her movements unhurried, almost spectral. There was no sound, no indication of how she'd gotten up there, or why she would be there at all. A cold dread washed over the grandmother, a primal fear that had nothing to do with practicality or common sense. She watched, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, until the figure slowly moved out of sight, disappearing over the far side of the roof. Shaken to her core, she retreated from the window, the image of the girl in the red dress seared into her memory. After the grandmother's terrifying rooftop sighting, a palpable sense of unease began to permeate the family home. It wasn't just the missing ducks anymore, or that single disturbing vision. Odd things started happening with increasing frequency, small disturbances that, when taken together, painted a very unsettling picture. Doors would creak open on their own, even when there was no draft. Objects would be found in different places from where they were left, as if moved by an unseen hand. Faint whispers seemed to drift through the house at night, too indistinct to understand but definitely there, just on the edge of hearing. Our narrator, who was a young boy at the time, initially dismissed these occurrences, or tried to find logical explanations. Houses make noises, people misplace things. It was easy to rationalize at first. But the atmosphere in the house had changed. There was a tension, a shared unspoken fear that lingered in the air, especially after dark. He started noticing his parents exchanging worried glances, his grandmother growing more withdrawn and watchful. The cheerful normalcy of their Willow Creek life was slowly being eroded by a creeping dread, a sense of being intruded upon by something unseen and malevolent. One afternoon, driven by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a boyish desire for adventure, the narrator found himself drawn to the area near the pond where the ducks used to congregate, close to the fence line of the abandoned property. He was poking around in the overgrown reeds and tall grass, perhaps subconsciously still looking for any sign of the missing ducks, when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Partially concealed beneath a decaying pile of leaves and muck was a small collection of bones. They were too small to be human, he thought, probably animal bones. But there were so many of them, jumbled together in a disturbing way. His heart pounding in his chest, he cautiously brushed away more of the debris, and then he saw it, sending a fresh wave of horror through him, a small, bloodied skull. It was difficult to tell what kind of animal it had belonged to, but the matted fur still clinging to it, and the dark, dried blood, were undeniably gruesome. This wasn't just some old animal remains, this felt recent and violent. The proximity to their pond, the place where their ducks had vanished, was chilling. He backed away slowly, the image of the bones and the skull burning into his mind, a horrifying puzzle piece clicking into place alongside the story of the girl on the roof. The discovery of the bones and the bloodied skull had a profound impact on the young narrator. The vague sense of unease that had been hovering over the family solidified into a very real and potent fear. Sleep became a nightly battle, his imagination conjuring all sorts of terrifying scenarios. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside his window, sounded like a prelude to something dreadful. He kept replaying the image of the bones, the red-dressed girl his grandmother had seen, and the unsettling quiet that had replaced the cheerful sounds of their ducks. The world suddenly felt a lot less safe, the shadows in his room a lot deeper. A few nights after his grim discovery by the pond, the narrator was lying in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, too quiet. A strange compulsion, similar to the one his grandmother had experienced, urged him to look out his window, which also offered a view of the backyard and the ominous dark shape of the abandoned house. He tried to resist, to tell himself it was just his fear getting the better of him, but the pull was too strong. With a sense of trepidation, he slipped out of bed and crept towards the window, his breath catching in his throat. And there she was, the girl in the red dress. This time she wasn't on the distant rooftop, she was closer, much closer. Standing near the edge of their property, by the fence line that separated their yard from the overgrown wilderness of the abandoned house, almost directly where he had found the bones. She was just standing there, bathed in the pale, eerie glow of the moon, perfectly still. He could see her more clearly now, and the sight sent a jolt of pure terror through him. Her eyes, fixed directly on him, or so it seemed, were like dark, empty sockets, devoid of any light or life. But it was her mouth that was the most horrifying. It was twitching, a series of small, unnatural spasms that contorted her lips into a silent, grotesque grimace. There was no sound, just this silent, unnerving movement, and those vacant eyes staring. He felt rooted to the spot, a scream trapped in his throat. It felt like an eternity. Him and this spectral figure locked in a terrifying, silent exchange. Then as suddenly as she had appeared, she slowly turned and melted back into the deep shadows of the abandoned property, leaving the narrator trembling, gasping for air, and forever haunted by the image of her empty eyes and twitching mouth. Our next story takes us to the somber, murky waters of a deep lake, a place that held a tragic secret. A young boy had gone missing weeks before, last seen playing near the lake's edge. Extensive searches by local authorities and volunteers had yielded nothing, no trace of him, as if the lake itself had swallowed him whole. The community was gripped by a quiet despair, the family desperate for answers, for closure, for anything that could end the agonizing uncertainty. The hope of finding him alive had long since faded, replaced by the grim necessity of recovery. Enter our protagonist, a professional diver, a man seasoned by years of exploring the silent, often treacherous world beneath the waves. This wasn't his first recovery mission. He was known for his skill, his composure under pressure, and his ability to navigate challenging underwater environments. He was called in when other efforts had failed, when the depth and poor visibility of the lake proved too much for standard search teams. He understood the risks, the psychological toll of such a task, but it was a job he felt compelled to do, to bring solace, however grim, to a grieving family. The lake in question was notorious. It was exceptionally deep, plunging into darkness far below the reach of sunlight. Its waters were perpetually murky, visibility often reduced to mere feet, sometimes inches, due to sediment and algae. Locals whispered tales about it, of strange currents and things lost in its depths that were never found. For the diver, it presented a formidable challenge, a cold, lightless environment where disorientation was a constant threat, and the weight of the water above felt immense, pressing in from all sides. This was not a dive for the faint of heart. As he prepared his gear on the shore, a somber mood hung heavy in the air. The family of the missing boy watched from a distance, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and dread. The diver went through his pre-dive checks with meticulous care, his mind focused, pushing aside the inherent sadness of the situation to concentrate on the technical aspects of the dive. He knew that finding the boy in this vast, opaque abyss would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, but he was determined. With a final nod to the surface crew, he slipped beneath the cold, unwelcoming surface, descending into the silent, waiting darkness. The descent was slow, methodical. As the diver sank deeper, the familiar sounds of the surface world faded away, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of his regulator and the occasional crackle on his comms line. Sunlight, which had dappled the surface, quickly surrendered to an oppressive gloom, and soon he was enveloped in near-total darkness, relying entirely on his powerful dive lights to cut a narrow swath through the murky water. The temperature dropped significantly, the cold seeping into his suit, a constant reminder of the inhospitable environment he was now navigating. He moved across the lake bed, his lights scanning the silty bottom. It was an alien landscape, desolate and eerily quiet. The pressure at this depth was immense, a physical force pressing against him, and the visibility was as bad as predicted. Silt billowed up with every movement, further obscuring his vision, forcing him to proceed with extreme caution. He was acutely aware of his isolation, a lone figure in a vast, dark, and potentially dangerous underwater world. Hours could pass like this, a painstaking grid search in the cold and the dark, hoping for a sign, any sign. And then, his light beam fell upon something. At first it was just an indistinct shape in the periphery of the illuminated circle, but as he moved closer, his heart began to pound. It was the missing boy. He was lying on the silty lake bed, almost as if he were asleep. But what struck the diver with a profound sense of unease was the boy's condition. He was perfectly intact. There were no signs of decomposition, no evidence of predation by aquatic life, which would have been expected after weeks submerged in the lake. His clothes were undisturbed, his features peaceful, almost serene. It was as if time had frozen for him in that specific spot, preserved against the natural processes of decay, in a way that seemed utterly unnatural. The diver had seen many tragic things in his career, but this was different. There was an eerie stillness about the scene, a sense of profound wrongness that went beyond the tragedy of a lost life. He hovered there for a moment, taking in the sight, a mixture of relief at having found him, and a deep, unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the water temperature. The boy looked as if he had only just settled there moments ago, not weeks. Steeling himself, the diver knew he had a solemn task to perform. He had to bring the boy back to the surface, to his waiting family. He radioed his surface team, his voice calm despite the turmoil of emotions he was experiencing, informing them of his discovery and his intention to begin the retrieval. He approached the boy's still form with care and respect, the beam of his light steady, though his mind was racing with the strangeness of the boy's preservation. He prepared the recovery harness, his movements practiced and efficient, trying to focus solely on the mechanics of the job. He gently began to secure the harness around the boy, his touch light, reverent. The silence of the deep lake seemed to press in on him, amplifying the sound of his own breathing. He was just about to signal his readiness to ascend when it happened. Suddenly, without any warning, something grabbed his arm with incredible force, yanking him downwards, away from the boy, deeper into the silt and the darkness. It was a violent, powerful pull, completely unexpected and utterly terrifying. He hadn't seen anything, heard anything. It was as if an invisible hand had shot out from the lakebed itself. Panic surged through him, a primal instinct to survive. He thrashed wildly, trying to break free from whatever had him in its grasp. His dive light, dislodged by the struggle, spun away, its beam careening madly through the murky water. momentarily illuminating swirling clouds of silt and then plunging him into disorienting near darkness. He couldn't see his attacker, couldn't identify what it was, only felt its crushing grip and the relentless downward pressure. It felt immensely strong, far stronger than any human, and it was pulling him away from his lifeline, away from any hope of escape. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he twisted and kicked, fighting against the unseen assailant. He had no idea what he was fighting, only that it was trying to drag him into the abyss. He could feel his air supply dwindling, his heart hammering against his ribs. In a final desperate maneuver, he managed to wrench his arm free, the release so sudden he almost lost his orientation. Scrambling, he found his drop light, its beam now weak and erratic, and pushed off the bottom with all his might, rocketing towards the surface, not daring to look back, the terror of that unseen force clawing at his mind. He breached the surface, gasping for air, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the terrifying ordeal. The surface crew, alarmed by his panicked ascent and garbled communications, quickly pulled him aboard the boat. He was disoriented, shaken to his core, babbling about being attacked, about something grabbing him from below. He tried to explain the violent pull, the unseen force that had nearly dragged him to his doom in the lightless depths of the lake, but his words were jumbled, laced with the raw terror of his experience. Once he had calmed down somewhat and his gear was removed, he noticed a searing pain in his arm, the one that had been grabbed. He pulled back the sleeve of his dive suit, and there, etched into his skin, were several long, deep scratches. They weren't scrapes or abrasions from rocks or debris. They looked like claw marks, angry red welts already beginning to swell. This was physical evidence, undeniable proof that something had physically assaulted him down there in the oppressive darkness of the lake bed. He showed them to the crew, his voice shaking, insisting that he wasn't imagining things. However, when the official report was filed and the incident reviewed, the diver's account was met with skepticism. Officials, perhaps unwilling to acknowledge something so inexplicable, attributed his experience to nitrogen narcosis or rapture of the deep, a condition that can cause hallucinations and impaired judgment in divers at extreme depths. Or perhaps, they suggested, it was oxygen deprivation, leading to a vivid, terrifying hallucination. The scratches, they theorized, could have been self-inflicted during his panicked ascent, or caused by snagging on his own equipment or some unseen debris. But the diver knew what he had felt. He knew the difference between a hallucination and a physical assault. The claw-like marks on his arm were a constant, painful reminder of the terror he had faced. They were too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. The boy's body, by the way, was later recovered by another team, from a slightly different location, still eerily preserved. The diver never went back to that lake. He was left with the chilling certainty that something ancient and malevolent lurked in its murky depths, something that guarded its secrets fiercely, and the scars on his arm told a story that no official dismissal could ever erase. Tonight's third story takes us into a situation that, on the surface, probably sounds pretty familiar to a lot of folks. It starts in a place designed for loud music, dim lights, and maybe, just maybe, making a connection with someone new. Our storyteller, let's call him Mark, found himself in exactly such a place, a bustling nightclub downtown. He'd had a long week, the kind that grinds you down bit by bit, and all he wanted was to let off some steam, enjoy the rhythm, and perhaps share a laugh or two. The air was thick with the thumping bass, a kaleidoscope of lights danced across the crowd, and for a moment, Mark felt the stress of his week begin to melt away, replaced by the vibrant energy of the night. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just looking for a good time, a brief escape from the mundane. He'd been nursing a drink at the bar, casually scanning the room when his eyes landed on her. And let me tell you, in a room full of people all trying to stand out, she just did. Effortlessly. She had this aura about her, an almost magnetic pull that drew his attention and held it fast. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she certainly was, in a way that seemed both classic and uniquely modern. It was something in her eyes, a spark of an intriguing mystery. Or maybe it was the way she carried herself, confident and serene amidst the controlled chaos of the club. Mark found himself momentarily forgetting the music, the crowd, everything but the sight of her. He tried to play it cool, but he knew deep down that this wasn't just a passing glance. The walk to her apartment was short, just a few blocks through the sleeping city streets. The cool night air was a welcome change after the stuffy club, and Mark felt a sense of calm excitement. Her apartment building was unassuming from the outside, just another brick facade in a long line of them, but when she opened the door to her unit, he was pleasantly surprised. It was stylishly decorated, clean, and had a cozy, lived-in feel. There was a faint scent of something pleasant, maybe incense or an old candle lingering in the air. He took off his jacket, feeling comfortable, feeling like this was a perfectly normal end to a surprisingly good night out. He genuinely thought he'd lucked out, meeting someone so engaging and, seemingly, so normal. They settled onto her comfortable sofa, and for a little while things continued much as they had at the club. They talked, they laughed, and the connection he'd felt earlier seemed to deepen in the quiet intimacy of her living room. She poured them both a glass of water, and Mark found himself relaxing even more, shedding the last vestiges of his earlier social anxieties. He was completely at ease, unaware that the atmosphere was about to subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, begin to shift. He was in her space now, her domain, and the rules he would soon learn were entirely her own. He just didn't know those rules yet, or how strictly they would be enforced. Mark was now decidedly uncomfortable. The playful, flirtatious vibe of the evening had completely vanished, replaced by this strange, almost clinical interrogation. He tried to laugh it off, to make a joke, but his attempts at levity fell flat against her unwavering seriousness. He suggested politely that it was getting late, that perhaps he should think about heading home. He was trying to be diplomatic, to extricate himself from the situation without causing any offense, but he could feel a knot tightening in his stomach. He was acutely aware that he was in her apartment, on her terms, and the door suddenly seemed very far away. He just wanted out, to rewind the night to before he'd accepted her invitation. Her reaction to his suggestion that he leave was chilling. The already cool demeanor she'd adopted dropped several degrees further, into a realm of undisguised frost. Her eyes, which he had earlier complimented as expressive, now seemed to harden, becoming cold, flat, and utterly devoid of the warmth they'd held just hours before. "You're not going anywhere," she stated, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a flat, undeniable fact. The softness in her voice was completely gone, replaced by a steely edge that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, palpable tension. He knew with a sickening certainty that he had misjudged this woman and this situation very, very badly. Mark's mind was racing, a maelstrom of fear and adrenaline. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out, but she was between him and the door, the knife a silent, gleaming threat. He knew he had to play along, at least for a moment, to buy himself some time, to look for an opening. He stammered out compliments, trying to sound sincere, trying to say whatever he thought she wanted to hear. He told her she was beautiful, that she was amazing, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to control it. Her eyes remained fixed on him, searching, judging. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back, the desperate thumping of his own heart, almost deafening in the terrifying silence of the room, broken only by his forced praises and her soft, unnerving breathing. He continued to talk, his eyes darting around, desperately seeking any chance, any distraction. He noticed his jacket, slung over a chair near the entryway. His keys, his phone, they were in that jacket. If he could just get to it. It was a slim chance, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. As she seemed momentarily satisfied with one of his fear-induced compliments, her grip on the knife perhaps a fraction looser, he saw his moment. In a sudden burst of pure, unadulterated terror-fueled energy, Mark lunged from the sofa, not towards her but towards his jacket and the door beyond. He snatched the jacket, fumbling, his fingers clumsy with panic, expecting at any second to feel the cold steel of the knife in his back. Alright, so the fourth story tonight is one that starts off, like many unsettling tales do, in a place of normalcy, almost comfort. This woman, let's call her Sarah, was in a relationship. And for a while things were good, you know? The kind of relationship where you build a life together, share dreams, the usual stuff. But then, little things started to surface, tiny cracks in what she thought was a solid foundation. At first they were almost imperceptible, like a faint discordant note in an otherwise pleasant melody. Maybe he'd get a little too possessive, or his mood would shift a bit too quickly for comfort. She'd brush it off, thinking, oh, he's just stressed, or everyone has their quirks. But these weren't just quirks, they were something else, something slowly uncoiling in the background. Then came the incident with the knife. And this, folks, is where things take a sharp, undeniable turn into the truly bizarre and deeply unsettling. Sarah walked into the kitchen one evening, expecting to find her boyfriend, let's call him Mark, maybe making dinner or just grabbing a snack. Instead, she found him holding one of their larger kitchen knives, not cutting anything, not preparing food, but just holding it, and he was talking to it, not muttering to himself absent-mindedly. No, he was having a full-blown, one-sided conversation with this inanimate piece of sharpened steel, as if it were a confidant, a living entity that could hear and understand him. His voice was low, intense, and the words she couldn't quite make out only added to the sheer creepiness of the scene unfolding before her very eyes. The stalking, as you can imagine, didn't just stay at that subtle level. It began to escalate, becoming more frequent, more brazen, almost as if Mark was testing her boundaries, or perhaps didn't even recognize them anymore. There were times she'd look out her window late at night and see his silhouette standing across the street, just watching her apartment. The feeling of being constantly observed, of her privacy being systematically invaded, started to take a serious toll. Her home, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a fishbowl. The cryptic messages also continued, sometimes escalating to voicemails where he'd just breathe heavily or whisper phrases that made no sense but carried an undeniable undercurrent of menace. Sleep became a luxury she could scarcely afford, her nights filled with unease. Eventually Sarah knew she couldn't continue living like this. The man she thought she knew was either gone or had been a carefully constructed illusion all along. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she confronted Mark and told him it was over. She needed to end the relationship, not just for her peace of mind but for her fundamental sense of security. The conversation itself was incredibly tense. She described him as being eerily calm at first, which was almost more disturbing than an outburst would have been. He just listened, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. There was no begging, no pleading, just a quiet acceptance that felt wrong, like the calm before a particularly violent storm. In the immediate aftermath of the breakup, a fragile sense of relief settled over Sarah. For a few days it seemed like he had actually accepted it. The late-night vigils outside her apartment stopped, the strange messages ceased, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe that the nightmare might finally be over. She started to breathe a little easier, thinking perhaps the directness of the breakup had finally gotten through to him, that he understood the finality of her decision. She began to tentatively reclaim her life, hoping to put the whole disturbing chapter behind her and move forward, away from the fear that had become her constant companion for so long. But that relief, as you might have guessed, was short-lived, a cruel trick played by a situation that was far from resolved. It wasn't long before the first sign appeared that Mark hadn't moved on, that he wasn't going to just let go. It was subtle at first, a hang-up call where she was sure she heard his distinct breathing before the line went dead, an item moved in her apartment when she was certain she hadn't touched it. These small things reignited her fear, confirming her deepest dread. The breakup hadn't ended his obsession, it had perhaps only fueled it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and the man she had once loved was now a genuine threat lurking just outside her perception. With the chilling understanding that Mark was still a presence in her life despite the breakup, Sarah's daily routines transformed into a series of defensive maneuvers. Every aspect of her life became dictated by a pervasive fear. Before leaving her apartment, she'd meticulously check the peephole, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd vary her routes to work, constantly glancing over her shoulder, scrutinizing every car that seemed to linger too long behind her. Double-locking her doors and windows became a ritual, each click of the bolt a small, inadequate shield against the encroaching dread. Her social life dwindled as the fear of him appearing, of making a scene or worse, became too overwhelming to manage. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense, a slow erosion of her sense of self and safety. Paranoia became her unwelcome roommate. Every unexpected noise, a floorboard creaking in the night, a rustle of leaves outside her window, the distant wail of a siren, would send jolts of adrenaline through her system. She found herself jumping at shadows, her nerves frayed to their breaking point. Relaxing, even in the perceived safety of her own home, became an impossible task. The image of Mark, particularly the memory of him talking to that knife, was seared into her mind, a constant reminder of the unpredictable and dangerous nature of the man she was trying to escape. Sleep was elusive, often interrupted by nightmares where he was always present, always watching. Then came a particular night, a night where the oppressive weight of her fear reached a terrifying new peak. It wasn't a specific sound that set it off, not initially anyway, but more of a feeling, a profound, chilling sense that she was not alone in her apartment. The air felt different, heavier, like the static before a lightning strike. Every hair on her arm stood on end, an instinctual alarm bell ringing deep within her. She lay in her bed, the lights blazing as usual, but the illumination offered no comfort this time. Instead, it seemed to cast longer, more menacing shadows in the corners of her vision, making her question what lurked just beyond the periphery of her sight. An intense internal debate began to rage within her. Was this real, or was the stress finally getting to her, her mind playing cruel tricks fueled by months of anxiety and sleep deprivation? She tried to rationalize, to tell herself it was just the old building settling, the wind, anything but the terrifying alternative. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing second. It was a primal fear, the kind that bypasses logic and goes straight for the gut. She strained her ears, listening for any telltale sign, any breath, any footfall that wasn't her own. The silence of the apartment was deafening, yet somehow it felt pregnant with an unseen presence, a silent observer in her most private space. And that's when the truly horrifying thought wormed its way into her mind, a thought so chilling it made her blood run cold. What if he's already inside? What if, despite all her precautions, despite the locks and the lights, he had found a way in? The idea was paralyzing. Her apartment, her last bastion of supposed safety, could already be compromised. She imagined him hiding in a closet under the bed, or just standing silently in the shadows of another room, watching her, waiting. The sheer vulnerability of that possibility was overwhelming. How long could he have been there? What was he planning? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. The story, as it was shared, doesn't offer a neat resolution, no dramatic confrontation or definitive capture. It ends with Sarah trapped in this state of heightened, unbearable dread. The fear wasn't just that he returned, it was the sickening possibility that he was an invisible, malevolent force within her own walls. She was left to live with this constant, gnawing uncertainty, the terrifying ambiguity of whether the creaks and whispers were just her imagination, or the subtle signs of an ex-boyfriend who had crossed the line from spurned lover to silent, unseen tormentor. And that, folks, is a truly terrifying place to be, wondering if the monster isn't just at the door but has already been invited in. Our final story tonight delves into a different kind of horror, the kind that festers within something you hold dear, something you trust implicitly, a close friendship. The person who shared this story, let's call him Alex, had a best friend, someone he'd known for years. Let's name him Ben. Their bond was the kind most people cherish, built on shared experiences, inside jokes, and an unspoken understanding that they always had each other's backs. They were practically brothers, navigating life's ups and downs together. It was a solid, dependable friendship, or so Alex believed for a very long time, a constant in an ever-changing world. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, Alex started to notice subtle shifts in Ben, tiny little deviations from the friend he knew so well. It wasn't one big event, but rather a series of small, unsettling moments that, when strung together, began to paint a disturbing picture. Maybe Ben would make a comment that was unusually cruel, or react to a situation with an unnerving lack of empathy. Sometimes he'd laugh at things that weren't funny, or display a flicker of something cold and calculating in his eyes that Alex had never seen before. These were small cracks, easily papered over with excuses like he's having a bad day, or I must have misunderstood, but they were cracks nonetheless, slowly spider-webbing across the surface of their friendship. As time went on, the unsettling occurrences around Ben started to form a more distinct and disturbing pattern. One of the first truly alarming trends was the disappearance of pets in their neighborhood. It started with Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning Persian cat, Fluffy, vanishing without a trace. Then, young Timmy's beagle, Buster, who never strayed far, simply didn't come home one evening. More pets followed, disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Alex couldn't help but notice Ben's peculiar lack of concern, sometimes even a strange, detached curiosity when these disappearances were discussed. While everyone else was worried or saddened, Ben seemed almost indifferent or worse, subtly amused by the growing panic. Then the disappearances escalated from pets to people. Now these weren't front-page news kidnappings, but individuals on the periphery of their social circle, or acquaintances from town, who just stopped being around. Someone from Ben's old workplace who'd had a disagreement with him suddenly moved away without telling anyone. A casual acquaintance Alex and Ben both knew, who had a minor run-in with Ben at a party, seemed to drop off the face of the earth. There was never any direct evidence linking Ben to these vanishings, of course, just a series of unsettling coincidences that started to feel less and less coincidental the more they piled up. Alex found himself replaying conversations, looking for clues, for connections, however tenuous. The unease Alex felt around Ben eventually solidified into genuine fear after one particularly disturbing incident. They were hanging out at Ben's place and Ben was recounting a story about a conflict he'd had with a colleague. As he spoke, his voice became colder. His eyes took on that familiar, unsettling glint, and he described in far too much detail how he'd like to see that colleague suffer. It wasn't just angry venting, there was a relish in his tone, a palpable pleasure in imagining someone else's pain that went far beyond normal frustration. Then, he picked up a heavy letter opener from his desk, idly balancing it in his hand, his gaze fixed on Alex, almost as if he was gauging his reaction, or perhaps issuing a veiled warning. That moment was a clear turning point for Alex. Alex found himself in an agonizing position. A part of him, the loyal friend, wanted to believe there was an explanation, that Ben was just going through a rough patch, maybe needed help. He even considered trying to talk to Ben, to confront him about his behavior, but the memory of that coldness in his eyes, the casual way he handled the letter opener while talking about someone suffering, made Alex hesitate. What if confronting him made things worse? What if it turned that veiled threat into something more direct? He also thought about confiding in mutual friends, But how could he explain his fears without sounding paranoid, without concrete evidence? He was isolated by the very nature of the horror he suspected. With Ben supposedly miles away, Alex approached his friend's house, the spare key feeling heavy and cold in his trembling hand. Letting himself in felt like a profound betrayal, yet an unavoidable necessity. The house itself was eerily quiet, the silence amplifying every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. He moved cautiously, his senses on high alert, half expecting Ben to suddenly appear. His primary target was the basement, a place that had always been shrouded in mystery. Ben had always been overly protective of it, always had an excuse why no one could go down there. Now Alex was about to find out why. The door to the basement was, as expected, locked, but Alex had come prepared with a few basic tools, his resolve hardening with each step. After a few tense minutes of fiddling with the surprisingly simple lock, he managed to get the door open. A gust of cool, damp, and faintly metallic-smelling air wafted up from the darkness below, sending an involuntary shiver down his spine. He found a flashlight Ben kept near the door and clicked it on, its beam cutting a nervous path into the oppressive gloom. Slowly, hesitantly, he descended the creaking wooden stairs, each step echoing ominously in the subterranean space. The basement was larger than he expected, cluttered with the usual forgotten items, but there was an order to some of the chaos that felt intentional. He swept the flashlight beam around, searching for anything out of the ordinary, anything that might explain the change in Ben. And then, in a far corner of the basement, partially obscured by a tarpaulin, Alex saw it. The story, as he related, is very specific about one thing. He never ever says exactly what he found down there. He doesn't describe the object, the scene, or the nature of the horror that confronted him. All he conveys is the sheer, unadulterated terror and revulsion that washed over him in that instant. His description focuses entirely on his reaction, the sudden violent nausea, the way his blood ran cold, the immediate, instinctual understanding that he had stumbled upon something truly monstrous, something that explained everything and nothing all at once. Whatever it was a sight so horrific it defied words, a truth so dark it threatened to shatter his sanity. He didn't scream, he didn't investigate further, he didn't even pause to think. His body reacted before his mind could fully process the nightmare he had uncovered. He turned and fled, scrambling back up the basement stairs, bursting out of the house and running. He ran harder and faster than he ever had in his life, not looking back. The horrifying image from the basement seared permanently into his mind's eye. He never spoke to Ben again. He never went back to that house. He never found out what happened to Ben, and frankly, he didn't want to know. The discovery in that basement was the horrifying, unspoken end to their friendship, leaving Alex with a chilling certainty about his former friend and a secret he would carry with him for the rest of his life. A testament to the darkness that can lurk behind even the most familiar faces. And that brings us to the end of tonight's collection of true horror stories. Thank you for watching, for sticking with us through these unsettling accounts. Each one, in its own way, touches on those deep-seated fears, the unknown, the familiar turning sinister, the loss of control. We've journeyed from a mysterious girl in a red dress to the murky depths of a haunted lake, from a dangerously charming encounter to the terrifying unraveling of an ex-boyfriend, and finally, to the horrifying secret hidden by a best friend. These stories remind us that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't supernatural monsters, but the darkness that can exist in ordinary places and ordinary people. Now, I'm really curious to know, which of these stories unsettled you the most? Was it the chilling certainty of the diver, the psychological dread of the ex-boyfriend, or the unspoken horror in the basement? Let us know your thoughts and which tale got under your skin in the comment section below. We genuinely love reading your reactions and hearing which elements resonated or terrified you the most. Your engagement is what makes this community so fantastic. and it helps us understand what kind of strange, dark, and mysterious stories you want to hear more of in the future. Sharing your thoughts really does make a difference. And speaking of sharing, if you have a horror story of your own, something strange or unexplainable that happened to you or someone you know, we would absolutely love to hear it. You can share your experiences in the comments or reach out to us through the channels mentioned in the description. You never know, your story might be the one that keeps someone else up all night in a future video. These accounts are so powerful because they often come from real experiences, those moments that defy easy explanation and leave a lasting, chilling impression on those who live through them. So, as we wrap up, if you enjoyed these stories, or if they at least made you double-check your locks tonight, please do us a huge favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel out more than you know. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next dive into the strange, dark, and mysterious. We've got plenty more unsettling tales to share. Until next time, thank you again for joining us, and maybe leave a nightlight on. You might just need it. Eerie music begins to swell and fades out slowly.